So I remember we were in the Animal Kingdom part of the park. I was always really interested in natural history when I was growing up, so I was particularly excited to see this part of the park and was incredibly happy and excited to be there. I had to wait 3 whole days at this place before we finally got to see that particular part of it, and every other kid there seemed to be just as happy as I was, all except one. On the shuttle bus out of the park, I remember seeing this one little girl with her dad who looked uncharacteristically miserable for a kid who had the actual good fortune of visiting this place. But I mean, there's always one moody kid out of the bunch, isn't there? One who never seems to have any fun no matter what's happening. So honestly, as confused as I was about it, I forgot about it pretty quickly, as my own excitement at seeing all the animals quickly overwhelmed me. My favourite film was The Lion King, so go figure, I was buzzed. But throughout the day, whether we were on the rides or on the little safari tour thing, or eating at one of the cafes there, I'd see this little girl and her dad, and she looked consistently exhausted and unhappy. I found myself staring to the point where my mum and dad were like, "Stop staring at other kids, it's rude." So I did, because I knew they were right. Of course it was rude to stare, and besides that, the little girl seemed awful upset, and surely me staring at her would just make her feel worse. So a little while later, I remember walking around, drinking one of those ginormous American zillion ounce sodas or whatever, happy as Larry, when I see this little girl and her dad in front of us. I'm not going to pretend I was like I knew something was wrong. I sensed it, because I didn't, not all. But one thing struck me as kind of odd about the whole thing was by the time I was 10, I hated holding my mum or dad's hand. It's what babies did, in my opinion, as a 10-year-old. And just like me, this little girl didn't seem all that keen on holding her dad's hand, and at one point even tried to shake it loose. But he kept holding on to her, and at one point started properly gripping her around the waist, telling her to behave. I obviously found this kind of distressing, and I looked up at my dad as if to be like, "Are you seeing this?" Half expecting to be told to stop staring again. Both my parents looked kind of concerned about what was going on, but I didn't dare say anything. I was old enough to know that some kids misbehave sometimes, and people around just had to do that kind of cringy thing that we pretend it's not happening kind of feeling. Only then, instead of just calming down, the little girl bursts into tears and starts wailing, "I want my mummy! I want my mummy!" While the guy is trying his best to calm her down, like, "Oh, we'll get you mummy soon, sweetie," and all this other stuff. What happened next is kind of a blur in my memory. There was just a lot of commotion. But this is how my dad tells the story from his perspective. Apparently, while the girl is waiting, my dad hears her blatantly say, "I want daddy, where is my daddy?" The way he tells it, the mood in the crowd around us like visibly shifts as it suddenly becomes obvious that this guy that had been taking her around the park was not her father. There's slight hesitation though. No one actually acts on the revelation for the first few minutes or so. And for good reason, because the guy might have been her uncle or a family friend or a legal guardian or carer. There was nothing evidently insidious about it. That is, until the guy snaps at her in a way that is distinctly unparental. Apparently, some other American dad was all like, "Is there a problem, buddy?" And the guy is quick to calm the situation down by telling them that no, there's no problem. The little girl is just having a temper tantrum. Then someone asks if the guy is actually the girl's dad, to which he apparently replies yes, before trying to reassure the gathering crowd that everything was okay and she was just having a tantrum. Now, the next part I remember pretty clearly because the girl shouted something before the man clamped his hand over her mouth so hard it sounded like a slap. My mum started to pull me and my little sister away from the scene since it was starting to turn ugly, like really ugly, really fast. According to my dad's version of it, what the girl had screamed before the guy tried to shut her up was that he wasn't her dad at all. Not only that, but he had took her. That's when it starts getting confusing for me again because all kinds of people were moving forward and blocking my view, shouting and shoving kicks off. But I do remember seeing this woman shove her way through the crowd of people with the same little girl in her arms, who by that point was just sobbing uncontrollably. After that, I remember seeing the crowd that had formed around the guy begin to sway and shift. There were lots of shouts and screams, and I mean the kind of screams that were so intense and frightening that they made me shake and shiver with fear, and my little sister burst into tears. By the time the park security showed up, who 10-year-old me just assumed were the police, the crowd had begun to disperse, and I remember distinctly seeing the man who had apparently taken the little girl from God knows where, pinned to the ground with somebody on top of him. That's about the only part that I could still remember crystal clear to this day. A lot of my memory has been filled in with my mum and dad's retelling of the event, but the image of the guy's rage and how it twisted up his features, it still burns into my mind, and it's made more sinister by the fact that I now know what he was so angry about. He'd taken that little girl and kept her pliant because he'd promised her a trip around Disneyland. She was probably so keen to go that she hadn't fought back, and God knows what he was intending on doing with her afterwards. That chance had been taken away from him by a bunch of do-gooders. At least that's the way I imagine he thought of it. Playing this sick, long game of lulling his prey into a false sense of security before he finally got his way with her. Not that I realised any of that at the time. We have absolutely no idea what happened to the man or the little girl after that, and no one spoke about it for the rest of the holiday. Thank God there were people there that reacted the way they did, and thank God that she spoke up when she did, because I really don't want to think about the alternative.